Imagine making a decision that means you will never see another human being outside your own family, ever again. In 1936, Karp and Akulina Lykov did exactly that. They gathered their two small children, took a Bible and a spinning wheel, and walked into the most remote forest on Earth. For 42 years, they lived utterly alone. No neighbors, no radio, no knowledge of World War II or the moon landing. When they were finally discovered in 1978, they had no idea the world had changed beyond recognition. Today, I want to share their story, not as a curiosity, but as a mirror that asks each of us, what would you be willing to sacrifice for freedom? Here's the path we'll follow. First, we'll understand the historical nightmare that made a father choose the wilderness over civilization. Then we'll step into the Taiga itself, a landscape so vast and hostile that even today, helicopters struggle to reach it. We'll relive the moment a Soviet pilot spotted something impossible in 1978. We'll meet each member of the family up close. We'll examine, practically, how you survive when you have nothing but your hands and your faith. And finally, we'll meet Agafia, the last Lykov, still living in that same forest at 81 years old. By the end, I hope you'll see this not as a historical oddity, but as one of the most profound human endurance stories ever recorded. To understand why a family would choose total isolation, you have to understand the terror of Stalin's Soviet Union in the 1930s. The Lykovs were old believers, members of a fundamentalist Orthodox Christian sect that had been persecuted since the 17th century. Under Stalin, that persecution turned lethal. Religious communities were targeted, arrested, executed. And for Karp Lykov, the threat wasn't abstract. He watched Bolshevik patrols murder his own brother. That was the moment the world became more dangerous than the wilderness. That was the moment the Lykovs began to vanish. Picture this moment. Karp Lykov has just watched his brother murdered by the very state that's supposed to protect him. He's a pacifist. His faith forbids revenge. He looks at his wife, Akulina, and his two young children. He has one decision to make: stay and wait for the knock on the door or leave everything behind. They chose the wilderness, not because they were adventurers or survivalists, but because the forest felt safer than the soldiers. They took almost nothing: a Bible, because their faith was the reason they were fleeing; a spinning wheel, because Akulina knew they'd need clothes; and seeds. Those seeds would become the difference between life and death. Then they walked east, toward mountains no map could truly describe, and they did not look back. Let those numbers sink in. 250 kilometers, that's roughly the distance from London to Manchester, or from New York to Baltimore, without a single house, a single road, a single human footprint that wasn't their own. The Lykovs didn't camp in a forest. They buried themselves in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Winter temperatures drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The growing season is brutally short. Wolves and bears are not occasional visitors, they're neighbors. And yet, in this place that seems designed to reject human life, the Lykovs built a home that would last nearly half a century. How? That's the question that makes their story not just remarkable, but almost unbelievable. Now fast forward 42 years. It's the summer of 1978. A Soviet helicopter is flying a routine geological survey over the Sayan Mountains, scouting landing zones for a team of geologists. The area is officially uninhabited. There shouldn't be anything down there but trees and rock. But the pilot notices something strange on a mountainside. A clearing. Furrows that look suspiciously like a garden. A structure, hand-built, barely visible through the canopy. He circles back. What he's about to find will become one of the most extraordinary discoveries in modern Russian history. The geologists approached with a mix of curiosity and fear. Who would live here 150 miles from civilization? When they reached the homestead, they found Karp Lykov, an elderly man whose clothes were literally patched together from sacking material. He was wary but not hostile. Inside the cabin, his daughters Natalia and Agafia were weeping and praying. These were the first strangers they had ever seen. Remember, Agafia was 33 years old and had never laid eyes on a human being outside her family. The geologists tried to explain the outside world. They mentioned the war. What war? The Lykovs asked. World War II had come and gone. Stalin had been dead for a quarter century. men had walked on the moon, and this family knew none of it. The discovery wasn't just a human interest story, it was a time capsule. Let me introduce you to each of them because they weren't just a family in the woods. They were 6 distinct human beings, each with a role that kept the whole fragile system alive. Karp was the patriarch, the decision-maker, the one whose faith never wavered. Akulina was the mother who quite literally starved herself to death so her children could eat. In 1961, when food ran desperately short, she stopped eating. Savin became the family's spiritual anchor. Natalia cooked whatever the taiga provided. Dmitri, the youngest son, became a self-taught hunter. Imagine learning to track, trap, and skin animals with no teacher, no book, no mentor. And then there's Agafia, born in 1945, in a hollowed-out pine log that served as a washtub. She was the first Lykov child born in the wilderness, and as of today, in 2026, she is 81 years old and still lives in that same forest. She is the last living witness to one of the most extraordinary human experiments in isolation ever recorded. Now let's get practical. How do you actually survive when you start with nothing but seeds and a spinning wheel? On the food side, the Lykovs became expert foragers. Pine nuts were their staple, calorie-dense and storable. They cultivated a garden at 6,000 feet, which is almost unheard of. The growing season is brutally short. Dmitri taught himself to hunt by trial and error. Imagine setting a trap wrong 100 times before it works, with your family's survival depending on getting it right eventually. On the shelter side, they built everything from raw timber. They couldn't afford to let the fire die, not ever, because at -40 you don't wake up from that mistake. Every single item they owned was made by their own hands from materials within walking distance. This wasn't a lifestyle choice. This was what survival looks like when there is no backup plan. But let's not romanticize this. 42 years of isolation came at a devastating price. The family nearly starved multiple times. In 1961, Akulina chose to stop eating so her children could survive. She died of starvation. 20 years later, in 1981, a catastrophic winter killed 3 of the 4 remaining Lykov children, Savin, Natalia, and Dmitri, all within months of each other. The geologists who discovered them brought modern food that the Lykovs' bodies could barely process. And perhaps most haunting, after the discovery, some family members began to die sooner, not from disease, but from the shock of contact with a world they couldn't comprehend. Karp refused to leave the taiga for medical treatment, saying he would rather die in the forest than live in a hospital. He got his wish in 1988. Isolation protected them from Stalin. It also consumed them. And then there is Agafia, the last Lykov. Born in 1945 in a pine washtub on the floor of a dark cabin, she has never lived anywhere but the taiga. She has been offered homes in cities, medical care, modern conveniences. She refuses them all. After her father died in 1988, she spent years as the only human being in an area the size of a small country. She's had visitors, journalists from Vice, scientists, fellow old believers who made pilgrimages to meet her. But she has never truly joined our world. And here's what's remarkable. She isn't miserable. She describes her life with clarity and even contentment. Her existence challenges a core assumption we all share, that a meaningful life requires community, connection, and participation in society. Agafia proves that's not universally true. Some people are built differently. So let me leave you with a question, and I mean it genuinely, not rhetorically. What would you give up to be free? The Lykovs gave up salt. They gave up flour. They gave up shoes that weren't made of bark. They gave up doctors, neighbors, news, and the entire arc of 20th century history. And they did it willingly, for one reason, so they could worship God in their own way without a state telling them they were criminals for doing so. Was it worth it? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what does their story reveal about us? About the things we call necessities that are actually luxuries? About the depth of human adaptability we never test because we never have to? Agafia is still out there right now, 81 years old, tending the same garden her mother planted, in the same clearing her father cut from the forest. She is not a relic. She is proof that the human spirit can endure almost anything, if it chooses to.